Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Now, you all may be aware that we work from a lectionary, which means that every Sunday there are 4 readings assigned. The Old Testament lesson, the Psalm, the Epistle, and the Gospel. And those lessons are not, sometimes they're related thematically, sometimes they're just read sequentially. So for example, the readings from James, we're just reading through chunks of the letter of James. So they don't necessarily go together. And it's not what preachers are always supposed to do, but sometimes we manage to tie them together. Usually I've done 3, very rarely I've done 4. So we're going to see if I can nail the quadrifecta today. Bear with me. So our first reading today is from the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs 31, if you spent any time within or adjacent to evangelical communities, it is a scripture passage that is offered up often as the model of biblical womanhood. Which I think is really funny because often, there are parts of evangelical Christianity that tend not to lift up women as powerful agents of their own destiny. And I wonder if they've actually read this. Because this is a powerful, powerful picture of a woman. She owns property and can choose to sell it. She runs a business. She has people who work for her. She's amazing. And I'm kind of tired reading about her. Because I don't know how I'm supposed to, meet those standards. I don't know if any of you feel that way, but oh my goodness. It's amazing and daunting. And then in the text from the letter of James, we have really practical things. I love that we have the letter of James. For those who might want a bit of trivia, Martin Luther wanted to take the letter of James out of the Bible. He didn't like it. In part because Martin Luther loved Paul. I also love Paul. But James is clearly, we don't know a lot about this letter, but he's clearly writing in response to Paul. Paul says, it's all grace, faith, not works. And James, you can see James raising his hand in the back saying, yes, but we still have to do stuff. And that's a lot of what we've been hearing over the summer in this letter. And here too, we have these kind of concrete instructions about how to live. Wisdom that is pure and peaceable and gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits. And I'm getting a little tired again because it's a list. And James gives us the downside of it all that talks about, you do not have because you do not ask. Okay, so I'm going to ask, and then he says, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly. Well, what am I supposed to do? So, we're going to get back, I am going to bring the psalm back around, but let's go and look at the gospel because I think Jesus, as he does, is giving us some hints about how to redeem these 2 inspiring but tiring texts. In what we hear in the Gospel of Mark today, it's one of those passages where there's a few little vignettes. Jesus is walking with his disciples through Galilee. He's trying to keep it quiet because he wants to do some teaching. He realizes that they are having those unhelpful debates among themselves. They don't want to tell him. And so then he says, if you want to be in charge, you need to serve, which must have raised some eyebrows. And then he does that act that is the stuff of stained glass windows and rose-colored children's books. He brings a child into the midst of them. We love this scene because it's about cute children, right? Yeah, I'm going to do this thing. In Jesus' day, You had a very stratified, very hierarchical society, and the way that you survived was you sort of hitched your wagon to the next person more powerful than you as you went all the way to the top. And then you had a few people who had the wealth and the resources and the power. And what you hoped was that by hitching your wagon to the right one, you would get what you needed. It was definitely a trickle-down model. And at the very bottom of that human hierarchy were the children. Children weren't worth much in Jesus' day. I said that phrase at the first service, and it was really hard to say out loud because it feels really wrong. But in a society in which, if you were a peasant, you needed people who could work to make sure that people had something to eat. And children, up until, age 5, don't produce much. At 5, you could send them out to the fields or to go do their work. But children were not of high value. They were not of high status. And so in this moment, Jesus pulls a child into the circle. We don't know whether the child had snot running down her nose, or whether she had bathed, or whether there were lice. I mean, this was, it's a random kid, we think. Brings the child into the circle and says, if you want to know how I'm going to organize my community, this is where we start. This is where we start. And in welcoming and embracing this one who can give you no benefits, except potentially, you are welcoming me. And he says, this is striking, especially in the Gospel of Mark, which tends not to have a really flowery theology. He says, not only are you welcoming me, you are welcoming the one who sent me. You are welcoming God when you welcome this child. Now, anybody who's heard me preach more than maybe twice, this will start to feel familiar, but it is a consistent theme in Mark. I think about this child. I think about what it was like for this kid who might have been, chasing dogs down the street, or, helping mom with the cooking, or whatever children were doing at the moment. And this strange man pulls him into the middle of the circle and says, look at him. And he hears these words that say, when you welcome this child, you welcome me. What happens in the heart and the mind of a child when she hears these words? When she hears that she has as much value as this teacher that everyone is listening to. When they hear, not only are they as valuable as the teacher, but as valuable and as important as God. This is what I come back to over and over again in Jesus' message. Jesus says, you are beloved. Period. Final, irrevocable, true. Starting with the sniffly, stinky child, all the way up. All the way up, including those of us in the room. What does it mean to understand that you are a beloved child of God? What does it mean to turn to the person next to you, or outside of the doors of this church, turn to the person that is getting on your last nerve and say, you are a beloved child of God. Nothing I can do or say will change that. This becomes then a thing that starts bubbling up inside of you. Which brings me, quadrifecta, achieved, to the psalm. This psalm, we read the whole, I think it's the whole psalm today. It's short. And it's this lovely image of how immersing oneself in the law of the Lord. This is in these sacred words that we've been given in the Hebrew Scriptures. Just immersing oneself in that is like being a tree planted by a river, who draws up nourishment from the earth and from that water, and then puts out leaves and branches and bears fruit. The tree does what trees do. Trees don't have to try to be, I've never been a tree, but I'm going to assume that trees do not have to try to be trees. They just are. In order to be the tree, they need to draw up the nourishment, and that nourishment, that clear water from the stream, comes bubbling up inside the sap and out into the branches, and the tree becomes what that tree was meant to be. Its treeness comes out its pores. What if our own belovedness was like that water from the stream, and it flowed up inside of us, so that what we said and did in the world is simply an expression of who we are? Once I came to that realization in looking at these texts, the text from Proverbs and the text from James became a little less impressive. Because we can look at this woman who's held up as a kind of model. I do think her husband needs to do more around the house and her children, but still, I just look at this model of womanhood, and when you go look at the text again, there's a kind of ease to what is painted. She's like the tree. She has drawn her energy and her wealth from, or her strength from somewhere, and all that she does just seems to flow from who she is. Her work, her business acumen, her kindness to the poor, her wisdom just comes out in words. I do think it's more of an aspirational text than an actual person in the world, but it gives us something to shoot for, right? And then in this hardcore text from James, when he says, "Show by your life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom," this too is a picture of something just coming out your pores. If we can take the grace that we hear from Paul and grab that and understand that that is who we are, beloved and redeemed children of God, then what James is putting forth, not just here but in the rest of his letter, becomes not so much about a checklist of things that I have to do or duties that I have to accomplish. Things that I need to do in order to be good enough for God to love me or to be part of this community. Then it's something else. Then Paul and James are no longer at odds, but they are two sides of the same seed. You, my beloved trees, are planted by streams of water that babble, "You are beloved," all day and all night. "You are delightful in my eyes," whispers God in your ears, and that can flow up through your roots, into your branches, and out your leaves, and whatever fruit you bear. That's really great, right? Now I want to add just a little side thing, because I read this article last weekend, and this is somewhat tangential, but I think it's important. There is a New Testament scholar named David Bentley Hart who teaches at Notre Dame. He's done a fabulous new translation of the New Testament. And he published a book, whose name escapes me, that basically says that the concept of an eternal hell of torture is an abomination. Now, we can debate this later. But he has an article that unpacks some of the objections that folks have made to that, to his book. And part of what is brought up, I think, when we talk about hell is how are we going to hold people accountable? You know, we have to have some threat of punishment or else people won't behave. Except, what do we see in these texts today? What if it's not a threat of punishment? What if it's not a threat of exclusion? What if it's not a threat of not being good enough to be part of the whole? What if it's an invitation to absorb who we were meant to be? What if, in our struggles as Christians to live up to those high standards that Jesus sets for us, It's not about whether we fear failing, but it's about achieving what God has dreamt for us. How much more freeing is it? How much more freeing is it to turn and look at my sins? How much more freeing is it for me to consider forgiveness when it's not about a fear of punishment, but who I'm called to be and who the other is called to be? That's why you're here this morning. After these last couple of years, you really don't have to be here, even you all online. You didn't have to show up and turn on your computer or come down and put on your mask and sit in these pews. You don't have to do that. You are trees whose instinct is to seek the living water. And so you're here. And you're being nourished by the word. You're being lifted up in the prayers. And you will be fed at the table. You, my friends, are trees planted by living water. You are beloved children of God, and nothing can change that. The invitation is to bear your fruit. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.